Madam President, if you were to stop at Stella's Corner Restaurant on Main Street in Stratford for a lunch or a cup of coffee and ask the folks there, what do you expect from your government? I think one of the things they would say is that they expect the United States Congress and all of us here to keep our country safe. And when it comes to buying the equipment for our troops and allies, we should do so hands down, no doubt about it, buy American. Make it in America. Manufacture it in Connecticut or in the United States. Nothing could be more simple or straightforward. And yet somehow that Main Street common sense is simply ignored across the river in the United States Department of Defense, the Pentagon, where so many decisions are made. Since becoming a member of the Armed Services Committee, I've become aware that the Department of Defense committed almost $1 billion to provide Afghanistan a fleet of Mi-17 helicopters. Let me just repeat. Russian helicopters going to Afghanistan with American tax dollars and bought from the Russian export agency that at the same time is selling arms to Bashar Assad to kill his own people in Syria. Since 2005, the United States has been procuring Mi-17s to build the capacity of the Afghan military, and it's working toward a total fleet size of approximately 80 helicopters. The Afghan military had approximately 50 Mi-17s as of last year, and this year, the Army awarded a $572 million contract to purchase another 30, with approximately 15 more to come per year to replace the aging helicopters that the Afghan military already has run into the ground and failed to maintain. That's right, the Afghan military has failed to maintain those helicopters we bought previously. And now you would think that something had been done to provide the maintenance capacity for these new helicopters, but the answer is no. The contract to award these helicopters was managed in a way to prevent any American helicopter companies from bidding on the work, even though the Department of Defense's own analysis in 2010 concluded that the Made in America, and I'm quoting, CH-47D Chinook helicopter is the most cost-effective single-platform type fleet for the Afghan Air Force over a 20-year cycle, end of quote. Now, I acknowledge I may be partial to helicopters made in Connecticut. The best helicopters in the world are made in Connecticut by the Sikorsky employees who happen to stop at Stella's on Main Street for lunch or a cup of coffee, and I see them there all the time. And that H-92 troop transport helicopter of H-60 should also be considered by the Department of Defense for this mission. But at the end of the day, made in the USA ought to be the ruling principle. Made in the USA, American helicopters for the American military and American allies. In 2011, the Army contracted with the Russian state-owned arms export firm, Russo-Born Export. Yes, the very same Russo-Born Export that arms our enemies in Iran and is a key enabler of Assad's ongoing slaughter of his own civilians in Syria. Women and children in Syria die by the arms provided by Russo-Born Export, purchased by Assad with money financed by Russian banks and purchased from Russo-born export. Well-documented crimes against humanity, war crimes that eventually should be prosecuted. And I am working with my colleague, Senator Ayotte, on legislation to strengthen the contracting provisions that prohibit, quote, contracting with the enemy. These purchases are, in effect, supporting enemy purchases. And yet before us is a glaring example of contracting with the enemy. We've all heard testimony that preventing mass atrocities in Syria was complicated by their air and naval defense systems that prevent the protection of civilians in Syria and threatens its neighbors in Turkey and Jordan. Where did those systems come from? The answer is Russo-born export. The same systems that could shoot down our plane if we pursue additional measures against Syrian war crimes. The same entity that arms Iran, where we currently are seeking solutions against nuclear armament, and where we have said all options should be on the table in terms of our military action. The Department of Defense thinks the best thing for our long-term national security is to pay the Russian arms dealer that threatens global stability and our own freedom of action. But it gets worse, because without question, we've overpaid for these Russian helicopters. A general told me the best way to think about these helicopters is they are, quote, flying refrigerators that we never should have bought in the first place. We paid about $8 million a copy, while Russia sold other nations Mi-17s for $4 million each. What a bargain. Other countries buy each helicopter for $4 million. We pay $18 million. And it's still worse. The Army Acquisition Office that handled this contract is now under investigation for, quote, questionable transactions, including potentially improper payments to Russian companies involved in the repair of these helicopters, as well as problematic personal ties between the Army officials in this office and those foreign entities. Now, if I went to Stella's and I told this absolutely remarkable story, I am hoping that the folks there would have said, nah, you must be making this up. This couldn't happen in the United States Department of Defense. No way in the United States of America. Not with our tax dollars. But in fact, it is all true, and I have tried to put it as objectively and dispassionately as possible, just the facts. Well, we did something. At my urging and through the work of my colleagues who have spoken, including Senator Cornyn, Congress in the Defense Appropriations Act expressly prohibited the Department of Defense from spending any more taxpayer money on Russian helicopters and doing business with Russo-born export. And in fact, I wrote to the Secretary of Defense about this program. I've written numerous letters, and I have met with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Well, did that stop these purchases? No. The $500 million contract recently signed, recently completed, now underway by the United States Army for more Russian helicopters used previously appropriated funds to ignore the will of Congress. Clearly, the spirit and intent of the National Defense Authorization Act was to end these purchases, and the United States Department of Defense, in effect, has defied the will of Congress. So here we are today, almost $1 billion out the door, and the near certainty that these helicopters are going to be used to smuggle drugs, that's right, smuggle drugs, in Afghanistan. And that purchase has occurred. The contract's been completed. We can be sure that just as they failed to maintain those helicopters in the past, they will fail again in the future, because the Afghan National Security Forces doesn't have the people trained to maintain the helicopters. In fact, right now, it doesn't have the people trained to fly those helicopters. And in a few years, what the American taxpayer will have to show for this folly is rusted scrap heaps at Bagram Air Force Base. Now, I understand that some in the Pentagon started this program with good intentions. Their thinking may have been that the Afghans already had some of these helicopters in the process of standing up their capability to defend themselves. They ought to have a few more, and then the transition to a more capable helicopter. And I've heard from our generals that we need these helicopters because the Afghans know how to fly them. But the facts of the matter are that this program was never designed to be sustainable after we leave Afghanistan. And my hope is we will leave Afghanistan sooner rather than later. There is simply no transition place now or in the foreseeable future to buy American, to train those Afghan pilots how to fly American helicopters, how to maintain American helicopters. And when the Russians forced us to procure the helicopters from them directly, rather than excess helicopters from countries like the Czech Republic, we should have made a course correction immediately, even if we thought those kinds of helicopters were necessary in the short term. There were options and alternatives that should have been pursued, and they were not. And that's why I believe that the plan requested by the senior senator from Texas makes a lot of sense. He's asked the Department of Defense for an alternative plan for meeting the Afghan requirement. We can't walk away from a problem that we created. We can't walk away from the need for a transition. But there is a better way to get there. And the answer is very simply, buy American. Buy American helicopters. If they need helicopters, and there is a question whether they do, if all they're going to use them to perform is drug operations, and there is reliable information that the helicopters will be in fact used for drug smuggling and sales and illegal operations. But even if there is a legitimate need, even if there is a credible reason, buy American. I expect Mr. Estevez will be confirmed today. But I want to say to him, please, as one of your priorities, figure out a way to end these purchases from Russo-born export. You owe it to the members of this body, you owe it to the American people to find a way to buy American and to keep faith with the brave men and women who will use the equipment that you will help purchase with taxpayer dollars. I know you take this responsibility seriously, and I hope that you will bring that seriousness of purpose to these issues, because they are important, not just to the military and not just to taxpayers, but most especially to the brave American women who wear the uniform of the United States of America. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.